A watchful eye. The sun bathed the sleepy town of Oakwood in a gentle golden light as Sarah Matthews, a woman with a kind heart and tireless spirit, hurried about her morning routine. Her husband, Daniel, a devoted police officer with years of service under his belt, sat at their kitchen table, enjoying a simple breakfast she had prepared for him. The couple lived in a modest house in a quiet suburban neighborhood, surrounded by friendly neighbors and a sense of community that had always made them feel at home. Oakwood was the kind of town where everyone knew each other, and trouble was rare. Daniel had often remarked that his work as a cop wasn't always as exciting as the action-packed shows on TV. But Sarah and Daniel both took pride in their lives. Daniel, in keeping the peace, and Sarah, in her work at the local shelter, helping those in need. They had built a life of purpose and contentment together. Busy day ahead, Daniel asked, breaking the comfortable silence as he sipped his coffee. Sarah nodded, her auburn hair catching the morning light as she pulled it into a ponytail. We're organizing a food drive at the shelter today. It's going to be a long one, but it's always worth it. Daniel smiled warmly at her. You're always looking out for everyone. You do more good in this town than you know. Sarah brushed off the compliment with a wave of her hand. I just do what needs to be done. After breakfast, Daniel kissed her cheek and left for his shift. Sarah cleaned up the kitchen, her mind already drifting to the tasks awaiting her at the shelter. As she grabbed her car keys and prepared to head out, she felt a strange sensation, like a pair of eyes watching her. She paused, scanning the street outside her window, but saw nothing out of the ordinary, just a quiet neighborhood beginning another day. Shaking off the odd feeling, she headed to the local grocery store to pick up supplies for the food drive. As she moved through the aisles, selecting cans of soup and boxes of pasta, that same sensation returned. The hairs on the back of her neck prickled, and she glanced around, half expecting to see someone behind her. And then she saw her. A little girl, no more than 5 or 6 years old, was standing near a display of snacks, her big brown eyes fixed on Sarah. The girl was small, with dark curly hair tied into 2 neat puffs, and wore a faded pink dress that looked a little too big for her. Sarah's heart softened at the sight of her. She was a beautiful child, but something about the way she was staring gave Sarah pause. "Hello there," Sarah called softly, smiling as she took a few steps closer. The girl's eyes widened in alarm, and before Sarah could say another word, she darted behind the display and disappeared. Sarah stood there for a moment, puzzled. Where had she gone? And why had she run away so quickly? Maybe she was just shy, Sarah thought, or perhaps she was lost. Concerned but unsure what to do, Sarah finished her shopping and made her way to the checkout. But the memory of the little girl lingered in her mind. Later that afternoon, as Sarah unloaded the groceries at the community shelter, she found herself glancing over her shoulder more than once, half expecting to see the girl again. But the day passed uneventfully. The food drive was a success, with donations pouring in, and Sarah lost herself in the business of organizing volunteers and distributing food to those in need. Still, the image of those big brown eyes haunted her thoughts. As the sun began to set and Sarah made her way home, she decided to take a walk through the park near her house. It was a beautiful evening, the sky painted in hues of pink and orange, and she hoped a bit of fresh air would clear her head. But as she walked along the path, that same feeling returned, the sensation of being watched. Sarah slowed her steps, scanning the park around her. And then she saw her again. The little girl was sitting on a bench beneath a large oak tree, her legs swinging back and forth as she watched Sarah with the same intense, unwavering gaze. This time, Sarah felt a strong urge to approach her, to find out who she was and why she seemed to be following her. "Hi there," Sarah called out as she walked toward the girl, her voice gentle and inviting. "I saw you earlier today. Are you okay?" The girl didn't respond. She simply stared at Sarah, her eyes wide and filled with something Sarah couldn't quite place. Fear, perhaps, or maybe sadness. It was hard to tell, but whatever it was, it tugged at Sarah's heart. "My name's Sarah," she continued, keeping her tone soft. "What's your name?" The girl opened her mouth as if to speak, but no words came out. Instead, she slid off the bench and backed away, her eyes never leaving Sarah's. And then, just like before, she turned and ran, disappearing into the trees that lined the edge of the park. Sarah stood frozen for a moment, her heart pounding in her chest. What had just happened? Why did the girl keep running away? She seemed so frightened, but of what? And why did she keep following Sarah, watching her from a distance? When Sarah finally made it home, Daniel was already there, heating up dinner in the microwave. He greeted her with a warm smile, but as soon as he saw the look on her face, his smile faded. "What's wrong?" he asked, concern etched into his features. Sarah hesitated, unsure how to explain what had happened. "There's this little girl, Daniel. I saw her at the grocery store earlier today, and then again at the park. She's been following me, watching me. Every time I try to talk to her, she runs away." Daniel's brow furrowed as he listened, his police instincts kicking in. "A little girl. Following you. Did she seem lost?" Sarah shook her head. "I don't think so. She didn't look dirty or neglected. She just kept staring at me. It was like she wanted to say something, but she couldn't." Daniel sat down at the kitchen table, his expression serious. "That is strange. I'll keep an eye out for her while I'm on patrol. Maybe she's new to the neighborhood and just curious about you." "Maybe," Sarah agreed, though she didn't feel entirely convinced. There was something about the girl's eyes that unsettled her, a depth of emotion that no child that young should have to carry. As they finished dinner and settled in for the evening, Sarah tried to push the thoughts of the mysterious girl out of her mind. But that night, as she lay in bed next to Daniel, sleep eluded her. She kept replaying the day's encounters in her head, trying to make sense of it all. Why was this little girl following her? What was she so afraid of? And why did Sarah have the nagging feeling that this was only the beginning of something much bigger? As the clock ticked past midnight, Sarah made her way downstairs, hoping a cup of tea would help calm her restless mind. She stood by the kitchen window, staring out into the quiet street, when a movement caught her eye. There, standing beneath the streetlight, was the little girl. Sarah's breath caught in her throat. The girl was watching her again, her small figure bathed in the soft glow of the light. For a moment, they locked eyes through the glass, and then the girl turned and disappeared into the night, leaving Sarah with more questions than answers. A deeper mystery. The following morning, Sarah woke with the same unease that had kept her awake for most of the night. Her brief encounter with the little girl beneath the streetlight played over and over in her mind. Why was she standing there? What was she trying to communicate without words? There was an intensity in her gaze, something almost pleading, that Sarah couldn't shake. She had to find out who this girl was, where she came from, and most importantly, why she was so drawn to her. As Daniel prepared for his morning shift, Sarah sat at the kitchen table, absent-mindedly stirring her coffee. Her thoughts were far away, replaying every detail of her encounters with the girl. Daniel noticed her distraction and sat down across from her. "You're still thinking about her, aren't you?" he asked gently. Sarah nodded, not even bothering to hide her concern. "I saw her again last night. She was standing outside, under the streetlight, just staring at the house. I'm starting to think something is really wrong, Daniel." Daniel's eyes narrowed. "Standing outside? At night? That's definitely strange. Did you try to talk to her?" Sarah sighed, frustration and worry mixing in her voice. "No, by the time I realized she was there, she was gone. Just like before. It's like she's always one step ahead of me, watching from a distance, but never getting close enough to talk." Daniel rubbed his chin thoughtfully, his expression serious. "I'll do some checking around at the station. Maybe someone's filed a missing persons report, or there's something we don't know about. A little girl wandering the streets alone, especially at night. It's not safe. If there's something going on, We need to get to the bottom of it." Sarah felt a small surge of relief. Daniel's logical, methodical approach was one of the things she loved most about him. If anyone could figure out what was happening, it was him. She just hoped the girl wouldn't vanish completely before they had a chance to find her. Later that morning, Sarah went about her daily routine, though her mind was far from focused on the tasks at hand. She volunteered at the shelter as usual, helping to sort through donations and prepare meals for the homeless, but her thoughts kept drifting back to the little girl. Every time she heard footsteps or caught a glimpse of movement out of the corner of her eye, her heart would race, thinking it was her, but the girl was nowhere to be seen. As Sarah walked home from the shelter, the familiar sensation of being watched crept over her once again. She slowed her pace, scanning the street around her. This time, there was no sign of the little girl, but the feeling remained, a nagging sense that someone was nearby, hidden just out of sight. When Sarah reached her front porch, she hesitated before unlocking the door. She stood there for a moment, her eyes scanning the neighborhood, half expecting to see the girl peeking out from behind a tree or parked car. But the street was quiet, and no one appeared. With a heavy sigh, Sarah went inside and locked the door behind her. Later that evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and the shadows grew longer, Sarah found herself pacing the living room, anxiously waiting for Daniel to come home. She needed to know if he had found any information, any clues that might explain who this girl was and why she seemed to be following her. When the front door finally opened and Daniel stepped inside, Sarah rushed to meet him. "Did you find anything?" she asked, her voice tense with anticipation. Daniel shook his head, looking troubled. "Nothing yet. No missing persons reports, no one matching her description. It's like she doesn't exist." Sarah felt a wave of frustration wash over her. How can that be? She has to live somewhere. Someone must know her. Maybe I should ask around the neighborhood, see if anyone's seen her or knows who she is. That might not be a bad idea, Daniel agreed, though his expression was still cautious. But be careful, Sarah. We don't know anything about her or why she's following you. If something feels off, trust your instincts. I'll keep asking around at the station too. Someone has to know something. That night, Sarah barely slept. Every creak of the house, every rustle of leaves outside, made her sit up in bed, her heart pounding in her chest. She kept expecting to see the girl standing outside again, but the night passed uneventfully. And by morning, Sarah felt more exhausted than ever. Still, she was determined. She couldn't keep living like this, consumed by the mystery of a little girl who appeared and disappeared like a ghost. She had to do something. After breakfast, Sarah decided to take matters into her own hands. Armed with a notebook and a pen, she set out on foot, determined to ask around the neighborhood. She started with the house across the street, where the elderly Mrs. Robinson had lived for as long as Sarah could remember. "Good morning, Mrs. Robinson," Sarah said as the older woman answered the door with a warm smile. "I was wondering if I could ask you something." "Of course, dear," Mrs. Robinson replied, adjusting her glasses. "What can I do for you?" Sarah hesitated, unsure how to phrase her question. "Have you seen a little girl around here lately? She's about 5 or 6 years old, with curly hair. I've seen her a few times, but she always runs away before I can talk to her. I thought maybe she was new to the neighborhood." Mrs. Robinson frowned, shaking her head. "No, I haven't seen any little girls around here in ages. Most of the families with young children moved away years ago." "Are you sure she lives around here?" "I'm not sure of anything," Sarah admitted, feeling a bit foolish. "She just seems to be everywhere I go. I thought maybe someone might know who she is." "Well, I'm afraid I can't help you, dear," Mrs. Robinson said, though there was a flicker of concern in her eyes. "But if you do find out who she is, I hope she's okay. It's not right for a child that young to be wandering the streets alone." Sarah thanked Mrs. Robinson and moved on to the next house, and then the next. She asked half a dozen neighbors, but the answer was always the same. No one had seen the girl, No one knew who she was. It was as if the child had appeared out of thin air, with no connection to anyone or anything in the neighborhood. Frustrated and no closer to the truth, Sarah returned home, her notebook empty except for the names of neighbors who had no answers. She was beginning to feel like she was chasing a phantom, a figment of her imagination. But deep down, she knew the girl was real. She had seen her too many times, felt the weight of her gaze too often, to doubt that. As the afternoon wore on, Sarah tried to distract herself with housework, but the restless feeling gnawed at her. She couldn't shake the thought that the girl was out there somewhere, alone and scared, watching her from the shadows. What if she needed help? What if something terrible had happened to her? Sarah couldn't stand the thought of doing nothing while the girl remained a mystery. Just as the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the street, Sarah's phone rang. It was Daniel, his voice steady, but with a hint of urgency. "Sarah, I think I've found something. Can you meet me at the station?" Sarah's heart leaped into her throat. "What is it? Did you find out who she is?" "I'm not sure yet," Daniel replied. "But I've got a lead. I'll explain everything when you get here." Without hesitation, Sarah grabbed her keys and rushed out the door. As she drove to the police station, her mind raced with possibilities. What had Daniel found? Could this finally be the breakthrough they needed? Or was this just another dead end in an increasingly baffling mystery? When Sarah arrived at the station, Daniel was waiting for her in the lobby, his expression grim. "Follow me," he said, leading her down a hallway to a small conference room. Inside, there were a few files spread out on the table, along with a grainy black and white photo of a little girl. Sarah's breath caught in her throat as she recognized the face in the photo. It was the same girl who had been following her. "Her name is Amara," Daniel said quietly, handing her the file. "And there's more to her story than we ever could have imagined. Shadows of the past." Sarah stared at the photograph of Amara, her mind spinning as Daniel's words echoed in the small room. The face in the grainy black and white photo was unmistakable. The same large, expressive brown eyes, the same dark curls framing her young face. But in this photograph, Amara looked different, as if there was more light in her eyes, more innocence. Daniel sat down beside her, his usual calm demeanor betraying a hint of tension. "Her name is Amara Fields," he began, opening the file in front of him. "But Sarah, this isn't recent. The picture you're holding is from 5 years ago. Back then, Amara was just a baby." Sarah's hands trembled slightly as she placed the photo back on the table. "But that doesn't make any sense. The girl I've been seeing is 5 or 6 years old. She looks just like this photo, but older." Daniel's expression darkened as he leaned forward, resting his arms on the table. "That's the thing. This case is strange, Sarah. I've never seen anything like it in all my years on the force." He flipped through the file until he reached a report, printed in crisp black ink. "Amara Fields went missing almost 5 years ago. Her family used to live on the other side of Oakwood, in one of those old houses near the woods. Her mother, Lena Fields, was a single mom. No one knew much about them. Lena kept to herself, didn't interact with the community much." Sarah's heart sank as she listened, a sense of dread settling in her chest. What happened to them? Daniel glanced down at the report, his brow furrowed in concentration. Lena and Amara were reported missing by a neighbor who hadn't seen them for several days. When officers went to check on the house, they found it abandoned. No sign of a struggle, no personal belongings taken. It was like they had vanished overnight. But here's where it gets strange. Lena's car was still in the driveway, and the house was locked from the inside. Sarah blinked, her mind struggling to comprehend the gravity of what Daniel was saying. But where did they go? Did anyone ever find them? Daniel shook his head, his expression grim. "No one knows. The case went cold after a few months. There were no leads, no evidence of foul play. It's like they disappeared off the face of the earth. Eventually, the house was foreclosed, and people stopped talking about it. Most folks around here don't even remember the Fields family." Sarah's thoughts raced as she tried to piece everything together. But why is she here now? Why has Amara been following me? And where has she been all this time? Daniel's face tightened. I don't know, but I'm starting to think this isn't just a case of a missing child. There's something else going on. Something we're missing. Sarah's mind flashed back to all the strange encounters she'd had with the little girl. The way Amara would appear and disappear without a trace. The way she never spoke. The way her eyes seemed to carry the weight of something far too heavy for a child. A shiver ran down her spine as a terrible thought crossed her mind. Daniel, she whispered, her voice trembling. What if Amara isn't alive? The room fell silent, the weight of Sarah's words hanging in the air. Daniel didn't respond immediately. His jaw tightened, and he looked down at the file again, flipping through more pages as if searching for answers that weren't there. I've thought about that, he admitted, his voice low. But I don't want to jump to conclusions. I mean, she looks real enough, right? You've seen her, Sarah. She's not a figment of your imagination. Sarah shook her head, trying to clear the fog of confusion that clouded her mind. I don't know. I've seen her, yes, but every time I try to talk to her, she runs away. And she's always watching, always from a distance. It's like she's trapped in between. Like she's trying to tell me something but can't. Daniel rubbed his temples, clearly struggling to make sense of the situation. There has to be an explanation. If Amara is alive, she's been missing for years, and no one has seen her until now. If she's not. He trailed off, unable to finish the thought. Sarah's heart ached for the little girl, whether she was alive or not. No child should have to carry such sadness, such fear. She knew, deep down, that Amara was reaching out to her for a reason. She just didn't know what that reason was yet. Where is the house? Sarah asked suddenly, determination rising in her chest. Daniel blinked, surprised by the question. The Fields' house. It's on the edge of town, near the woods. But Sarah, it's been abandoned for years. No one's lived there since they disappeared. I need to see it, Sarah said, her voice steady but insistent. There's something about this, Daniel. I can feel it. I don't know why, but I think going to the house will help us understand what's going on. Daniel hesitated, clearly torn between his protective instincts and his trust in Sarah's intuition. He had always valued her insights, her ability to read situations and people with an almost uncanny accuracy. Finally, he sighed and nodded. All right, we'll go. But I'm coming with you, and we're doing this by the book. I'll notify the station, and we'll make sure everything's above board. Sarah nodded, grateful for Daniel's support. She knew that whatever was waiting for them at the Fields' house, it wouldn't be easy to face. But she also knew that she couldn't stop now, not when she was so close to uncovering the truth. The drive to the old Fields' house took them to a part of Oakwood that Sarah rarely visited. The further they got from the town center, the more isolated the streets became. Houses grew farther apart, and the landscape shifted from neat suburban lawns to dense clusters of trees and overgrown lots. The road wound deeper into the woods, and soon they found themselves on a narrow gravel path lined with tall, foreboding trees. Finally, they reached the house. The Fields' home stood at the end of a long, overgrown driveway, its windows dark, and its roof sagging from years of neglect. The front yard was a tangle of weeds, and the once white picket fence that surrounded the property was now a rotting skeleton, half collapsed and covered in vines. The house itself loomed like a forgotten relic, a place where time had stopped the moment Lena and Amara vanished. Sarah swallowed hard as she stepped out of the car, her heart pounding in her chest. There was something oppressive about the air here, something heavy and thick that seemed to press down on her shoulders. She could feel the weight of the past hanging over the house, like a dark cloud that refused to dissipate. Daniel joined her, his hand resting on the holster of his gun, his eyes scanning the perimeter of the property with the wariness of a seasoned cop. Stay close, he warned, his voice low. Together, they approached the front door. It was weathered and warped, but surprisingly, it was locked, just as the report had stated. Daniel pulled out a set of tools, his movements quick and precise, and within moments, the door creaked open, revealing the dark interior of the house. The inside was eerily quiet, the air stale and cold. Dust coated every surface, and the furniture, what little remained, was covered in sheets, as if the occupants had left in a hurry. A thick layer of dust on the floor showed no signs of recent activity. It was as though time had stood still since the day Lena and Amara disappeared. Sarah stepped cautiously into the foyer, her eyes adjusting to the dim light filtering through the grimy windows. She could feel a presence here, something lingering just beneath the surface, waiting to be uncovered. The house was filled with the echoes of a life interrupted, and the silence was deafening. As they moved deeper into the house, Sarah's heart began to race. There was something pulling her toward the back of the house, toward a door that led to what appeared to be the kitchen. She hesitated for a moment, feeling the weight of unseen eyes on her, before pushing the door open. Inside, the kitchen was just as abandoned as the rest of the house, but there was something different here, something that caught Sarah's attention immediately. A small pink hairbrush lay on the counter, untouched by the years of dust that covered everything else. It was as if someone had placed it there recently, a deliberate act in a place frozen in time. Sarah's breath caught in her throat as she picked up the hairbrush, her fingers trembling. She could feel it now, an undeniable connection between this house, this little girl, and herself. "Daniel," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I think Amara's still here." Daniel's eyes widened in alarm, and before he could respond, a soft sound echoed through the house, a faint, childlike whisper that sent a chill down Sarah's spine. "Help me." The voice was unmistakable. It was Amara's. Whispers in the dark. Sarah froze at the sound of the whisper, her breath catching in her throat. The voice was faint, almost like a breeze brushing past her ear, but it was unmistakably a child's voice, Amara's voice. She turned to Daniel, her wide eyes reflecting the shock and confusion she felt. "Did you hear that?" she whispered, her heart pounding in her chest. Daniel's face was pale, his usual calm demeanor replaced by an alertness Sarah hadn't seen in him before. He nodded slowly, his hand instinctively resting on the handle of his gun. "I heard it." The silence in the house felt even heavier now, as if the very walls were holding their breath. The weight of something unseen pressed down on them, and the sense of being watched, being followed, was palpable. Sarah felt as if she was standing on the edge of something vast and unknown, teetering between reality and something far more unsettling. "Help me." The whisper came again, this time clearer, as if the voice was just a few feet away. Sarah's blood ran cold. It wasn't just a trick of her mind. This was real. Amara was here, in this house, or at least something of her was. "Daniel," Sarah said, her voice barely audible, "we need to find her. I don't know how, but I know she's here. She's trying to reach out." Daniel hesitated, his instincts as a cop warring with his disbelief. "Sarah, we don't know what we're dealing with. This could be something. I don't know. Something dangerous. I'm not saying I don't believe you, but we need to be careful." Sarah turned to him, her eyes pleading. "I can't leave her. She's been following me for days, Daniel. Watching, waiting. She's asking for help. I know it." Daniel sighed, clearly torn, but he nodded. "Okay, we'll keep looking, but we stick together and we stay alert. If anything feels off, we leave." "Agreed." Sarah nodded, though the thought of leaving Amara behind without answers gnawed at her. They moved cautiously through the house, the floorboards creaking beneath their feet. Every room they entered was eerily untouched by time, like a museum of a life that had been abruptly interrupted. The kitchen, the living room, the bedrooms, all of them were filled with dust-covered furniture, but no signs of life. No clues to where Lena and Amara had gone, or why the little girl seemed to haunt Sarah's every step. As they entered what must have been Amara's bedroom, Sarah's heart ached. The room was small, with faded pink wallpaper and a single bed pushed up against the wall. A few stuffed animals sat neatly on a shelf, their once bright colors dulled by the passage of time. A dollhouse stood in the corner, its doors slightly ajar, as if someone had been playing with it and left in a hurry. The room had a sad, forgotten air about it, and Sarah couldn't help but wonder what had happened to the little girl who had once slept in this bed. "I don't get it," Daniel muttered as he scanned the room. "It's like they just vanished. No signs of a struggle, no signs that anyone's been here in years. How can a little girl just disappear like that?" Sarah didn't have an answer. She moved slowly through the room, her fingers brushing over the dust-covered furniture, as if she could feel the echoes of Amara's presence lingering in the air. Her gaze fell on a small nightstand next to the bed, and something caught her eye. A worn journal, its cover slightly askew. She picked it up carefully, dusting off the cover. The leather was soft and cracked from age, and the pages inside were yellowed. As she flipped it open, she realized it was a child's diary. The handwriting was uneven, the letters large and blocky, the way a young child writes when they're first learning. Sarah's breath caught in her throat as she read the first page. "Dear Diary, Mommy says I have to be a big girl now because Daddy is gone, but sometimes I feel scared. The man in the shadows comes at night, and I hide under my bed so he won't see me. Mommy says it's just a bad dream, but it feels real. I wish Daddy was here." Sarah felt a chill run down her spine. The man in the shadows. The word sent a shiver of fear through her, and she quickly turned the page, her hands trembling. The entries continued, each one filled with the innocent thoughts of a young child. Her favorite games, her love for her mother, her confusion and sadness about her father's absence. But there were more mentions of the man in the shadows, and each one seemed to grow more fearful, more desperate. "Dear Diary, he came again last night. I tried to hide, but he saw me. I don't like him. Mommy says he's not real, but I think he is. He talks to me in my dreams, and I don't want to listen. I'm scared." Sarah's heart raced as she read the final entry, written in a shaky hand. "Dear Diary, Mommy says we're leaving, but I don't know where. She's crying a lot, and she says we have to be careful because the man is watching us. I'm scared, but Mommy says it will be okay. I hope we can leave soon. I don't want to see him anymore." Sarah closed the diary, her hands shaking. The pieces were starting to come together in her mind, but the picture they formed was horrifying. Lena and Amara had been running from someone. But who was the man in the shadows? And what had happened to them after they left? Daniel, who had been watching her read in silence, stepped forward. "What is it?" Sarah handed him the diary, unable to find the words to explain the growing dread in her chest. Daniel flipped through the pages, his brow furrowing as he read. When he finished, he looked up at Sarah, his expression grim. "The man in the shadows," he said quietly. "Do you think it's connected to why they disappeared?" Sarah nodded, her throat tight. "I don't know who he is, but he's real, Daniel. Amara was terrified of him, and Lena knew they were being watched. Maybe that's why they left so suddenly." Daniel's jaw tightened as he considered the implications. If Lena was trying to escape from someone, it's possible she didn't tell anyone. She could have gone into hiding, or worse. Sarah didn't want to finish the thought, but the weight of it hung between them. Whatever had happened to Lena and Amara, it wasn't just a simple disappearance. Something darker was at play here. Suddenly, the whisper came again, louder this time, as if it was coming from the very walls of the house. "Help me." Sarah's breath caught in her throat. She turned, her eyes scanning the room, but there was no one there. And yet, the voice was so clear, so close. Daniel's hand instinctively went to his gun, his body tense. "We need to leave, Sarah. Something isn't right here." But Sarah couldn't leave. Not yet. She knew, somehow, deep in her gut, that they were on the verge of something. Something important, something that would help Amara. "I can't," Sarah whispered, her voice trembling. "I need to find her." Daniel opened his mouth to protest, but before he could say anything, there was a sudden, sharp creak from the hallway outside the room. The sound of footsteps, small, light footsteps, like those of a child. Sarah's eyes widened. Without thinking, she moved toward the door, her heart pounding. She could feel Amara's presence, could sense her nearby. She stepped out into the hallway, her pulse racing, her breath coming in short, shallow gasps. And there, at the end of the dimly lit corridor, stood Amara. The little girl was just as Sarah had seen her before, her dark curls, her wide brown eyes, her faded pink dress. But this time, there was something different about her. She looked more solid, more real, as if she was no longer just a fleeting shadow. "Amara," Sarah whispered, her voice catching in her throat. "I'm here. I want to help you." The little girl didn't move. She just stood there, staring at Sarah with those same haunting eyes, filled with fear and longing. For a moment, they simply looked at each other, the distance between them feeling both vast and intimate. And then, in a voice so soft it was barely a whisper, Amara spoke. "He's coming." Before Sarah could respond, the door at the far end of the hallway slammed shut with a deafening bang, and the air in the house grew thick and suffocating. The temperature plummeted, and an oppressive, malevolent energy filled the space, pressing down on them like a heavy weight. Daniel was at Sarah's side in an instant, his hand on her arm, pulling her back. "We need to go. Now." But Sarah couldn't take her eyes off Amara. The little girl was still standing there, but now her expression had changed. Her eyes were wide with terror, and her small body trembled as she whispered again, "He's here." Confronting the darkness. "He's here." Amara's words echoed in Sarah's mind, chilling her to the core. The little girl stood at the end of the hallway, her trembling form barely visible in the dim light, but the fear etched in her face was unmistakable. Whatever, or whoever, was coming, it was something Amara had been running from for a long time. Sarah's heart raced as the oppressive energy in the house thickened, pressing in on her and Daniel from all sides. Daniel, ever the protector, tightened his grip on Sarah's arm, pulling her back toward the entrance of the house. His instincts screamed to get out, to leave this dark place behind. But Sarah couldn't tear her eyes away from Amara. The little girl wasn't just afraid. She was pleading, silently begging for help, for salvation from whatever nightmare she had been trapped in for so long. "We need to leave," Daniel urged, his voice tight with urgency. "Sarah, now." But Sarah shook her head, her voice barely a whisper. "I can't, Daniel. I can't leave her." A cold gust of wind swept through the hallway, rattling the windows and making the floorboards creak beneath their feet. The air felt suffocating, heavy with a presence that Sarah could feel but not see. And then there it was again, the sound of footsteps, slow, deliberate, and far too heavy to belong to a child. The man in the shadows. Sarah's breath quickened as the sound grew closer. Her mind raced, trying to make sense of the situation. How could this be happening? How could Amara's fears, her diary entries, have come to life in such a terrifying way? She had been running from him for so long, and now he was here, in this house, the very place she had tried to escape. Daniel, ever the rational one, took a step forward, his hand hovering over his holstered gun. "Who's there?" he called out, his voice firm and commanding. "This is the police. Show yourself." But there was no answer, only the footsteps, growing louder and more menacing with each passing second. The shadows in the house seemed to shift and writhe, as if alive, twisting, and bending around the corners of the hallway, encroaching upon them. Sarah's mind flashed back to Amara's diary, to the entries where she had written about the man in the shadows, the one who came to her at night. "He talks to me in my dreams, and I don't want to listen." Was this the same entity? Was this a manifestation of Amara's deepest fears, or something more tangible, more dangerous? Amara's small voice broke through the tension again. "He's always watching. He won't let me leave." The heartbreak in her voice shattered Sarah's resolve to flee. She couldn't run away. Not now. Not when Amara was so close, so desperate for help. Sarah took a step forward, toward the little girl, despite Daniel's urgent warning to stop. "Amara," Sarah called out, her voice trembling but filled with determination. "You don't have to be afraid anymore. I'm here, and I won't let him hurt you." Amara's wide, frightened eyes locked onto Sarah's, and for a moment the girl's expression softened, a flicker of hope flashing across her face. But it was fleeting. The heavy footsteps grew closer, and the dark, shifting shadows seemed to swallow the hallway whole, plunging it into near darkness. And then, from the deepest part of the shadows, a figure emerged. At first it was just a silhouette, tall, gaunt, and inhumanly thin. But as it stepped closer, the details became clearer, and Sarah's stomach lurched with horror. The figure was wrapped in darkness, its face obscured by a hood that cast an unnatural shadow over its features. It moved with a slow, deliberate gait, as if savoring the fear it was spreading. Daniel drew his gun, stepping in front of Sarah. "Stay behind me," he ordered, his voice tense. The figure stopped just at the edge of the hallway, its presence filling the space with a malevolent energy so strong that it felt like the very air had been sucked from the room. It didn't speak, didn't move further, but Sarah could feel its gaze, cold and piercing, boring into her. "This isn't real," Daniel muttered under his breath, his voice shaky but resolute. "This can't be real." But Sarah knew, deep down, that it was real, at least to Amara. This was the thing that had haunted her dreams, the thing she had been running from for so long. It was the embodiment of her fear, her despair, her helplessness. "Amara," Sarah called out again, her voice stronger this time, despite the terror gnawing at her insides. "You don't have to be afraid of him anymore. You're not alone. We're here to help you." The little girl didn't move, didn't speak. She just stood there, trembling, as the dark figure loomed at the edge of the hallway. And then, to Sarah's horror, the figure raised a hand, long, bony fingers stretching out toward Amara, as if to pull her back into the shadows. "No," Sarah shouted, stepping forward, her heart pounding. "Don't touch her." Before Daniel could stop her, Sarah broke free from his protective grasp and rushed toward Amara. The air around her seemed to thicken, like wading through molasses, but she pushed forward, her determination stronger than her fear. "Amara," she cried out, reaching for the little girl. At the sound of Sarah's voice, Amara finally moved. She took a step toward Sarah, her tiny hand reaching out, her eyes wide with a mix of fear and hope. Sarah's heart swelled with relief as their fingers brushed. But then, the dark figure lunged. The shadows seemed to explode outward, wrapping around Amara like tendrils of darkness, pulling her back. Sarah screamed, her hand grasping at empty air as the little girl was dragged toward the figure. "No," Sarah screamed again, her voice raw with desperation. "Let her go." The figure's hooded face turned toward Sarah, and though its features were hidden, she could feel its malevolent gaze pierce through her. It spoke for the first time, its voice low and rasping, like the sound of wind howling through dead trees. "She belongs to me." Sarah's blood ran cold. This wasn't just a shadow or a figment of imagination. This was something far darker, something that had claimed Amara and refused to let her go. Sarah could feel its power, its hunger, but she refused to back down. "No," she shouted, her voice filled with a fierceness she hadn't known she possessed. "You can't have her. She's just a child. She doesn't belong to you." For a moment, the figure hesitated, as if taken aback by Sarah's defiance. The shadows around it wavered, flickering like a candle in the wind. And in that moment of weakness, Sarah saw her chance. She lunged forward again, this time grabbing Amara's hand with all her strength. The little girl's fingers were cold, almost icy, but Sarah held on tight, refusing to let go. "Amara," Sarah whispered, her voice shaking but filled with determination. "You're stronger than he is. You don't have to be afraid anymore. Fight him." Amara looked up at Sarah, her big brown eyes filled with tears. For a moment, the fear in her gaze was overwhelming. But then something shifted. The darkness that had clung to her for so long began to fade, replaced by a spark of hope, of strength. "I'm scared," Amara whispered, her voice trembling. "I know," Sarah whispered back, her grip tightening on the little girl's hand. "But you're not alone. I'm here. You can do this." Amara took a deep breath, her small body shaking, and then she turned to face the dark figure. The shadows writhed around it, but they no longer seemed as powerful, as terrifying. The figure seemed to sense this shift as well, its hand still outstretched, but faltering. "No," it hissed, its voice growing more desperate, more frantic. "She belongs to me." But Amara shook her head, her voice barely more than a whisper. "No, I don't." And then, with a strength that surprised even Sarah, Amara pulled herself free from the shadows. The tendrils of darkness snapped and recoiled, and the figure let out a piercing wail, its form flickering and fading. Sarah felt the oppressive weight in the air lift, the suffocating energy dissipating as the figure was forced back into the darkness from which it had come. The hallway grew brighter, the shadows retreating until the house was once again still and silent. For a moment, neither Sarah nor Daniel moved, both of them too stunned to process what had just happened. And then, slowly, Amara turned to Sarah, her eyes filled with a mixture of relief and exhaustion. "You did it," Sarah whispered, her voice filled with awe. "You're free, Amara." Amara nodded, but her expression was sad, as if she understood something that Sarah didn't. "I'm free," she whispered, her voice soft, almost fading. "But I can't stay." Sarah's heart clenched. "What do you mean?" "You don't have to leave. We can help you." Amara shook her head, her small hand still holding Sarah's. "The final goodbye." "I can't stay," Amara whispered again, her voice a fragile thread in the quiet aftermath. Her small hand was still wrapped around Sarah's, but her touch was growing colder, lighter, as though she were slipping away, not just physically, but from the world itself. Sarah's heart constricted painfully as the weight of Amara's words sank in. This wasn't just about freeing Amara from the malevolent figure that had haunted her for so long. This was something much more final, much more heartbreaking. "No," Sarah whispered, her voice trembling as she knelt down in front of the little girl. "You don't have to go. We're here now. We can help you, Daniel, and I. We'll protect you. We'll keep you safe." Amara's big brown eyes, once filled with so much fear, were now soft, sad, but resigned. She smiled faintly, a smile that seemed far too wise for a child her age. "You already did," she said softly, her voice like the rustle of leaves in the wind. "You helped me more than anyone ever could." Daniel, who had been standing a few feet away, watching in stunned silence, finally stepped forward. His face, usually so composed and steady, was lined with confusion and grief. "Amara," he began, his voice rough with emotion, "you don't have to go anywhere. We'll find a way to help you. We can figure this out." But Amara shook her head again, her curls bouncing slightly, the innocence of the gesture so at odds with the gravity of the moment. "No, you can't," she whispered. "I'm not supposed to be here anymore. I wasn't supposed to be here for a long time." Sarah's heart clenched, and tears blurred her vision. "But why, Amara? Why have you been following me? Why did you choose me? I don't understand." Amara took a deep breath, her tiny shoulders rising and falling with the weight of the answer she had been carrying all along. "Because you're kind," she said simply. "Because you see people, not just with your eyes, but with your heart. I knew you'd help me, even if you didn't know how at first, and because you remind me of my mommy." The last part broke something inside Sarah, a deep, aching crack that radiated through her chest. She had always known, on some level, that Amara saw something in her, something that drew her close. But hearing it out loud, the mention of Amara's mother, made it all so much more real, so much more painful. Tears slipped down Sarah's cheeks as she gently squeezed Amara's hand. "What happened to your mommy, Amara?" she asked softly, though a part of her was terrified to hear the answer. Amara's eyes glistened with tears of her own, but she didn't cry. Her voice remained steady, even as she spoke the words that no child should ever have to say. "She tried to protect me," she whispered. "We were running away from him, from the man in the shadows. He was always there, watching us, trying to take me. She did everything she could, but he wouldn't stop. One night, we tried to leave the house, to get far away, but—" She paused, her small lips trembling. "He found us. I don't remember everything, but I know she's gone. She's been gone for a long time." Sarah's breath caught in her throat. Lena, Amara's mother, had died that night trying to save her daughter. The weight of that realization was crushing. But how had Amara survived? Or had she? "What about you, Amara?" Daniel asked gently, his voice barely above a whisper. "What happened to you after that night?" Amara looked down at the floor, her bare feet barely brushing the dust-covered wood. "I don't know," she admitted. "I just stayed. I've been here, in this house, in the shadows, for a long time. I couldn't leave. I wanted to, but he wouldn't let me. I was trapped." Sarah's heart broke further. Amara hadn't just been lost. She had been trapped in this house, in the grip of the malevolent force that had taken her mother's life. She had been caught between life and death, stuck in a liminal space where no one could reach her, until now. "But you're free now," Sarah said, her voice thick with emotion. "You're not trapped anymore. You don't have to stay here. You can go wherever you want." Amara looked up at Sarah, her eyes filled with gratitude, but also with a deep, lingering sadness. "I know," she whispered, "but I can't go with you. I don't belong here anymore." Sarah shook her head, refusing to accept what was happening. "But where will you go? I don't understand, Amara. I don't want you to leave. You don't have to be alone." Amara stepped forward, her small hand lifting to rest against Sarah's cheek. The touch was light, like the brush of a breeze, but Sarah felt the warmth of it, the connection between them. "I won't be alone," Amara said softly. "I think my mommy's waiting for me. I feel her now. I couldn't feel her before, but I can now. She's not in the shadows anymore." Sarah's tears fell freely as she stared into Amara's eyes. This little girl, so strong, so brave, had endured so much, far more than any child should ever have to. And now she was ready to move on, to leave behind the pain, the fear, and the darkness that had held her captive for so long. "I'm scared," Sarah whispered, her voice breaking. "I don't want to lose you." Amara's smile was soft, gentle. "You won't lose me. You helped me, and I'll always remember that. I'll always remember you. But I have to go now. I have to be with my mommy." Daniel, standing a few feet away, his own eyes damp with unshed tears, stepped forward. "We'll never forget you, Amara," he said, his voice hoarse. "Thank you for letting us help you." Amara smiled at him, her expression filled with a wisdom far beyond her years. "Thank you for listening," she said quietly. And then, just as quickly as she had appeared, Amara began to fade. Sarah felt the shift in the air, the lightening of the oppressive energy, the lifting of the darkness that had clung to the house. Amara's form shimmered, becoming translucent, like a figure made of mist. The shadows that had once trapped her no longer had a hold on her, and she was finally free. "Goodbye," Amara whispered, her voice like the wind. Sarah reached out, her fingers brushing the air where Amara had been, but there was nothing to hold on to anymore. The little girl had vanished, her presence fading like the last rays of sunlight at dusk. The house, once filled with the weight of tragedy and fear, now felt empty, peaceful, even. The malevolent force that had held it in its grip was gone, dispelled by Amara's courage and Sarah's compassion. For a long moment, Sarah and Daniel stood in silence, absorbing what had just happened. The loss of Amara weighed heavily on Sarah's heart, but there was also a sense of relief, of closure. Amara was no longer trapped. She was free. Free to find her mother, to leave behind the pain that had kept her tethered to this world for so long. Finally, Daniel spoke, his voice quiet and filled with awe. Do you think she's really with her mother now?" Sarah nodded, wiping the tears from her cheeks. "I do. I think she's been waiting for this moment for a long time. And now she's where she belongs." They stood in silence for a while longer, the oppressive darkness that had once filled the house replaced by a calm stillness. The air was lighter now, and even the sun seemed to shine a little brighter through the grimy windows. "We should go," Daniel said softly. "There's nothing more for us here." Sarah nodded, but before they left the room, she turned back one last time to the spot where Amara had stood. Her heart swelled with a bittersweet mix of grief and gratitude. She had been given the chance to help this little girl, to free her from the shadows, and while the goodbye was painful, it was also necessary. "Goodbye, Amara," Sarah whispered. With one final, lingering glance at the now quiet house, Sarah and Daniel turned and walked toward the front door, leaving the darkness behind them. As they stepped outside, the sun was setting on the horizon, casting the world in hues of gold and orange, a far cry from the darkness that had once filled their hearts. And in that moment, Sarah felt it, Amara's presence, not as a ghost or a shadow, but as a memory, a whisper on the wind. She was free now, truly free, and Sarah knew, deep in her heart, that the little girl had found her way home. As they walked to the car, Daniel reached for Sarah's hand, squeezing it gently. "You did a good thing," he said quietly. "You helped her." Sarah smiled through her tears. "We helped her," she corrected softly. "And I think, in some way, she helped us too." And with that, they drove away from the house, leaving behind the shadows of the past, but carrying with them the memory of a little girl named Amara, who had finally found her peace.